And I'd like to, at this point, welcome Partha Narasimhan and ask that you guys welcome him with a warm round of applause. Thanks, Partha.
Good morning. So I have, my slides come up. So I guess I have less time than I thought I had, but the good news is, I only have 5 slides, one of which is this. In fact, when I submitted my slides, they thought I only had, they only got part of the slide deck, and I said, no, that's it, this is it, right? So, but the flip side of it is, okay, you have nothing to get distracted by, you got to look at me and pay attention to what I have to say, right? So let's talk a little bit about some of the trends that we've seen in the mobility side so far, and how they're changing what we do today, and then project it forward to what we expect to see or what we anticipate when the Internet of World comes in, right? So we are in the middle of a perfect storm over here, right? If you look at the mobile side of things, when the iPad was introduced, the world started moving to an all-wireless access network. I mean, I have 3 devices with me in my backpack. None of them has an Ethernet port, right? Even if I know what to do with that cable, which a lot of the younger generation doesn't, right? They've grown up thinking the world was always wireless. I know what to do with the cable, but I have nothing to plug them into on any of my devices. So the world is going all wireless from an access device perspective. So users are basically accessing their services, their data, their content using wireless technologies. And Rick mentioned this as well. A lot of the content and these data and the applications that they consume on their mobile devices is getting served out of the cloud, public, private, or combinations of those. So that's the second one that's happening. And the one that is slowly starting to hit our world is the Internet of Things, right? It means many things to many people, but basically we tried, I'm going to try and at least distill it down to what we think we see from our perspective in there. But these are coming together, and that is causing a lot of disruption in IT, the people that manage the networks, the people that manage the infrastructure, right? The second trend that we're seeing over here is that infrastructure decisions are not just tied to IT. There are many things where many other organizations, many other parts of the organization have a say in doing something. So let me give you a simple example. At Levi Stadium, we built the Wi-Fi network, right? And the people that built the stadium, they wanted to create a unique user experience. It's not just about connectivity, right? It's not just that I'm going to give you some high-speed connectivity into the internet and you guys go do what you want. They did consider on how to create a different experience, a unique experience as part of the stadium to get fans into the stadium. And one of the examples that I'm going to use here is this whole notion of food ordering, right? So at Levi Stadium, you have an app that you can use as you enter the stadium to watch the game. So the goal is that, okay, you paid a lot of money to come in to watch the game. I don't want to get you off your seat because you're hungry or you're thirsty to get out there, stand in line, pick up something or the other. So they created an app, and one of the things you could do with the app was to sit at your seat and order food, right? So if you look at the whole workflow of ordering food, you don't want people to think about other things, right? So the focus was, I give you a list of things that are available and you pick and choose and you place an order. I'm not going to ask you an additional thing in terms of, where are you seated, right? So one of the things they wanted to create was, if I have to minimize the amount of time you are away from your seat, then you place your order and I'm going to tell you when the food is ready and where to go pick it up. But if I know where you're located, I'm going to kind of make it available close to where you are. And then they had this thing of, okay, if you pay me $5 more, I can have somebody bring the food out to your seat, right? Which means that somehow the food ordering service needs to know where you're seated. So instead of having the user, asking the user that question, so you focus the user on what they're interested in, which is food, and let the network contribute metadata around the person ordering the food, like where they are located, where they're seated. In fact, in the second season, I know they were trialing something where you could actually order food and walk around, and they'll track you down and give you the food that you ordered. Right? I don't have results on how well that went and whether that's continuing into the third season now. But if you think about it, here's food ordering service. In the in the conventional sense, the network was just available to connect the device that's ordering the food, to the server that's going to take the order, and then do nothing else. Just place packets in there. Versus now, in the new workflow, the network's actually becoming an active participant in the whole process by contributing metadata about the user's location, right? Especially if you think about a user placing an order and walking around, and somebody having to track them down and give them their food. The only way that's going to happen is you're not going to ask the user every 5 seconds, okay, now tell me where you're located. So somehow the infrastructure has to contribute that part of it. So here's something where, as somebody makes an infrastructure decision, this is an important component. I mean, having the ability to locate a device that is placing an order was an important attribute of the infrastructure that they have to pick, right? So it's no longer just the networking guys making a choice and say, okay, I've connected all the nodes that you have on the network. You guys do whatever you want with it. Right? That's how we used to, as an industry, the networking industry has been known to model ourselves as plumbers. And now we're starting to become more than that, right? So that is where you're now at a point where these decisions are just not with just IT alone. They're going beyond what the conventional system used to work at. So one of the first things that we started with, if you look at IoT and think of what can I anticipate coming in here, the bring your own device phenomenon, or BYOD, was the first one that gave us some glimpse into, okay, what is going to happen. Now, if you look at when the iPad was introduced, here was a device that was targeted towards the consumer, but some of them wanted to bring it into work and use it as part of their work environment, right? So for the first time, IT was in a situation where they had to permit devices onto the network, give it access to certain parts of the organization's data and services, but this device was not supplied by IT, and it was not locked down to be compliant with policies of the organization, right? So this was the first time where there was an external device that needed to get in. So we had to go in and create tools to onboard the device, to give administrators mechanisms by which they can recognize that, okay, it's a valid user using or trying to access these services on a device that is compliant with the organization's policy, versus the same valid user trying to access data on a device that they brought from home. So because the iPad could walk with me, and I could connect it to my home network, to a network at a coffee shop, and who knows what other actors are around in any of those uncontrolled environments, that when I bring it back in there, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a trusted device anymore. So the level of trust that I place on a device that I don't manage or control is potentially significantly lower than what I do. So that was one of the first uncontrolled introductions into what was essentially until then a fairly controlled environment, which is enterprise network. So IoT is in a similar thing where it may not be end users that introduce these devices. Other people, like facilities department, wants to install a lot of sensors in these buildings, and those things are now going to connect into the network, right? So until now, IT has been able to keep them in a silo that doesn't intersect with the rest of the network, but as we'll see, the reasons why the IoT phenomenon is happening is that some of the aggregation at a contextual level is going to be useful. And it's no longer going to be sustainable for people to say, okay, yes, I have sensors in my building, but keep them off my network. Because there is information that you can actually use from those set of sensors that is relevant for other workflows that you're going to create in there. But the more important thing is that the moment these uncontrolled devices get inserted into the environment, you can no longer work with a model that I can just secure the perimeter, and what I have on the inside of the perimeter is a trusted environment, because you have a bunch of untrusted devices that have been inserted into what used to be the trusted environment. And if you look at many of the high-profile hacks that have happened in the recent past, a lot of them can be attributed partially at least to this model that we used to deploy networks where there was a big, giant, untrusted environment which was outside the enterprise, and then once you get in there, it was a trusted environment, and separating the two was a DMZ with a bunch of giant firewalls protecting one side from the other, or at least the trusted side from the untrusted side. And then combined with that is a physical security, which is that I need access to get into the building, and if I can somehow manage that access well, then my environment on the inside of the building or the inside of the enterprise network was supposedly trusted, right? But many of the newer hacks that have happened happen where somebody finds a way into some device on the trusted side of the network, and from there they fan out into anything else in there. If you think about it, an attacker doesn't necessarily have a choice of how they enter the environment. They're just looking at any which way that they can enter. But once they enter, if your network is deployed in such a way that there is a trusted side of the network, then they have complete liberty to go from one place that they've used to enter into the rest of the environment. So securing the perimeter is no longer sufficient. We have to look at alternate models where the entire network is untrusted, and you overlay or open up areas of trust based on need, based on context, which is probably limited potentially in time as well. So how do we create those models? Those become relevant in the new world here. So I want to focus a little bit on context. So this is the last slide that I have. So most of the discussion is around here. So at Aruba, we've always tried to leverage context, to understand context, to try and simplify various things, like for example, connectivity, right? How do I simplify network design? How do I simplify connectivity? Just because I have groups of users that I want to segment into their own individual groups doesn't mean that I need to create network grouping or network elements and translate that over into to the user space, right? So it was easy to do that when the network was just all wired, because the notion of VLANs was just completely transparent to end users. But if I translate that over into saying, okay, a network wireless SSIDs have to multiply now in order to allow me to segment users, then those things become visible to the user, and it creates user experience issues, right? Which network do I connect to? I see 5 different networks. Which one should I connect to? And if I have to educate users saying if you're using your enterprise supplied laptop, that is one, and if you're using iPad, connect to the other, and if you're using your phone, connect to a third one, that is too confusing for most people. They just want the simplicity. So, but leveraging that context to create a single network but provide the segmentation outside of user visibility but into the realm of IT was something that we've always had the ability to do, right? To distinguish users, employees, guests, contractors, to distinguish devices, right? IT supplied laptops, iPads and other things, and then to distinguish other types of resources like Apple TVs and printers that are common resources that are deployed by IT, right? So how do I leverage it to simplify network design was one thing. Security was the other factor. We talked about BYOD, but it was the same thing that even before we get into that, we've had instances where at one of the universities very early on, their funding model caused them to go deploy, every department to deploy their own network, but that created, again, poor user experience, that if I wanted to access something, a resource that belonged to the physics department, I had to go into their building in order for me to access it. I'm doing it wirelessly, but so that kind of made no sense. That's the equivalent of, again, translating the wired network paradigm into the wireless network, right? So we worked with them to try and build a common network that was campus-wide, but still have the policy segregation or segmentation that they desire, so that a user could connect to the network at any location, but leverage their identity and how they authenticated, how they connected to the network to give them access to things that they need to have access to, and then not necessarily for those that they don't have access to. So trying to get segmentation, again, it's tied back to to the connectivity layer, how do I simplify user experience? And how do I get to a secure environment that is compliant with IT's policies and so on? And when it comes to security, it is an ongoing thing. It is not just that, okay, I do a design and I push enter and I walk away and then it's going to run forever, right? So context, that's why context itself is something that changes with time, and you got to keep monitoring that. The example of me going to a coffee shop, turning on my iPad, connecting to an unsecured wireless network, getting infected with something and bringing it back into the enterprise. How do I now realize that, okay, something is different about my device today than it was yesterday? So security is an ongoing thing. And the third one that I want to at least spend some time on is insights. If you look at context, a piece of context has got multiple elements with it, right? We look at it, we use it either to apply a security policy or a quality of service policy, and then we throw it away and then move on to the next element of context. But suppose instead of throwing all of this away, I start accumulating this, then the data set that I get is extremely useful to look at patterns that are not visible, that are not obvious if I just look at small amounts of context at a time. Simple things like, can I realize that the number of devices per user is suddenly going up, and how do I make sure that I account for it in terms of capacity on the wireless network? We've been in instances where we've gone into a customer's network to troubleshoot a Wi-Fi problem, only to realize a couple of weeks later that everything is good about their Wi-Fi environment. The congestion is on their internet pipe, right? But to an end user, it's always that Wi-Fi is slow, right? But instead of looking at it as an exercise that happens after a user complains, can I now do some kind of predictive analysis, right? Can I get insights into the fact that suddenly the amount of video traffic on your network is higher, which would place a load or which would place constraints on the amount of internet bandwidth you need to provision for? So how do we now look at it at saying, okay, all of the contextual information that I have to leverage it into generating insights? So if you look at how it translates over into the IoT world that is going to come up, from a connectivity perspective, we are no longer looking at devices that have rich user interfaces that belong to users, right? Many of these devices that are going to get inserted into our environments are potentially headless devices that are going to run on batteries and who knows what else. We have examples of one of our university campus customers. The facilities department went in and replaced about 300 odd door locks in one of their residence halls to electronic door locks, and then they flip the switch on to have them connect over Wi-Fi, and of course it doesn't work. And they go talk to IT and say, we're not surprised it doesn't work. Our policies are designed in such a way that these things are not meant to work, right? So you should have probably consulted us before you deployed the first one, right? We could have tested it in there. So these are devices where we need to, ultimately, because the facilities people just look at it and say, okay, what's the big deal? It's just Wi-Fi, and I have the password, so I should be able to connect, right? So many of these things are going to get inserted into your environment where how do we make sure we create a workflow that kind of is similar to what we did for BYOD in onboarding all these devices with secure credentials in them, but now we have to do it in such a way that it's not an end user that's bringing a device and trying to onboard it onto the network. These are people, facilities people, or people that are going to deploy these devices, and these devices don't belong to them. They're just installers that are going to drop them in there. How do we create a workflow by which, as they install these devices, they can also securely onboard them and have them connected into the network? And what does it do to, again, the network design in terms of segmentation and so on? Security is another one. I'll start with a simple example, right? Near the beginning of the year, there was a person that came in to service the refrigerator in my home, and he looked at some label in the refrigerator and said that this has been in the house since 1989. We only owned the house for 10 years, right? While I'm glad that the refrigerator has been there operating for that long, but it also gives you a sense that many of the devices, IoT type of devices that are going to get inserted into our environments are going to be there for long periods of time. These are not like our mobile devices, which we tend to replace every other year or so, right? So the lifetime of these devices in our environments is going to be significantly longer. But if you look at the state of the art in 1989, and realized that, okay, the capabilities on that refrigerator are frozen in time when it was built and when it was deployed, versus the capabilities of an attacker are going to keep pace with the state of the art, right? So a device's ability from an IoT perspective, a device's ability to protect itself is actually going to diminish over time. And we've historically thought of security as device out, right? I have devices and I need to create policy so that I prevent its access to things that it should not do, or open up access to things that it should have access to. Versus in the IoT scenario, you've got to probably turn it around to where you're saying, I'm going to create structures or frameworks in the infrastructure that are going to have to now protect devices that can't protect themselves, right? If you look at, again, many of the recent incursions or attacks have happened with these kinds of headless devices, somehow somebody penetrating them and then using that to get onto the rest of the network. So how do we think about security where it's not just about, okay, yes, I have devices and I'm trying to protect their access into more sensitive data, but I might have to turn it around and say that, okay, I need to protect these devices from other devices that are trying to attack them, potentially. So that's the security part. And the insights, the last one here was to look at, again, I mentioned that it's no longer going to be tenable where many of these sensor networks that are already in many of your environments are going to come in, cannot be segregated away, right? They have to come in and intersect with the rest of the network, because there are things that we can learn from the other side. So there is a need to aggregate data at a contextual level, right? It's not, aggregation doesn't mean that I get 10 bytes from this sensor and 20 bytes from the other sensor and I'm packaging it up into a packet that contains 30 bytes together, but this is trying to contextually aggregate in there. An example is, many of the hotel rooms that we go into these days have a presence sensor or a motion sensor, so that if they think nobody's in the room, they have the ability to turn off the ventilation system, heating, and air conditioner, right? So all that is doing is a binary thing: is somebody inside or not, right? And if somebody is in there, I'm going to turn it on. If somebody is not there, I'm going to turn it off. But if I now augment it with other pieces of context, if I know who the customer is and what their preferences in terms of their optimum temperature level is, I can now combine it with the fact that yes, somebody is in there, but I also know who it is and what their preferences are, and go back and program the thermostat appropriately, right? So here's an example, and it's a very simple example, but an example where aggregating context from multiple sources gives you the ability to create a richer user experience, right? Because if I walk into a hotel room and the thermostat is automatically set without me going in and fiddling around, figuring out, okay, how do I raise the temperature to what I think I need it to be, that creates a far better user experience than if I didn't have to do it and the room was aware of who I was and knew what to set the thermostat to, right? So that kind of contextual aggregation is going to give us better insights so that we can turn it around and go back and create richer user experiences than what is possible today. So that is where we see, again, while we have to solve the connectivity problem and the security problem, but also how do we now aggregate contextual information together from newer sources that are going to come, that are going to get generated by the IoT devices that get inserted in there. So I'll end here. Thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak to you. Thank you.